Right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce Simon Anholt. It's also a humbling experience when you are introducing somebody who has advised over 50 governments and leaders around the world, who is a TED talker, and who has achieved many of the things that most of us can only dream of. Simon is sort of Mr. Branding, I suppose. I thought you won't have any qualms with that particular description, but it was also written about how we can, in the next few years, make the world a better place. So I don't know if I can start with a question for you, Simon. I suppose that's what interviews and fireside chats are all about. And instead of going to your most recent book, I'd like to go back a little bit further to the beginning of this millennium, where you wrote a book about Brand America, and you talked about it being the mother of all brands. And I suppose in this day and age, the question is: does America urgently need a rebranding? What are you going to say to President-elect Joe Biden when he gives you a call this afternoon about the rebranding of America? What would they have to do?
Matt, thank you. And thank you also for giving me that label, Mr. Branding, which I'm going to throw right back at you. I detest the idea of branding and always have done. It follows me around like a lame dog that's been limping after me for about 20 years. And I'm going to seize this opportunity to turn around and give it a kick. All I've ever done over the last 20 years is advise governments to steer well clear of branding. So I'm a branding expert in the same sense that William Wilberforce was a slavery expert. The idea that you can improve the image of a country by marketing tricks and by spending taxpayers' money on advertising and PR campaigns is a wicked lie. And the countries that try to do that shouldn't just not be in government, they should be in jail. It demonstrably doesn't work.
I can think about a few places here very nearby, post-Brexit, but that's by the by.
Yes, well, they're included in the unspoken list. It doesn't work, quite simply. I've been researching the images of nations for 20 years and have collected really a lot of data on this, more than 1 billion data points. And there is absolutely no correlation between how much money a country spends on trying to burnish its image and whether people admire it or not. So the book,
go ahead.
To answer your question about Brand America, basically what that book talked about is how America earned itself the position of being the most admired country on the planet, which it isn't at the moment, thanks mainly to the last 6 or 7 years of US foreign policy.
6 or 7 years, that's interesting. You expanded a little bit more than the 4 years that most people would think of. I suppose that sort of like segues us into the Good Country Index, which is slightly different, I suppose then.
Yes, the Good Country Index is a very different kind of study. The one I referred to before, the Nation Brands Index, is simply an opinion poll. It measures the opinions of 20,000 people around the world every year, has done since 2005, on their perceptions of 50 different countries. So that gives us a fairly accurate indicator of how well regarded countries are in some considerable detail. The Good Country Index, which I launched in 2014, totally different kettle of fish. This is a composite index which tries to measure how countries behave, specifically the impact they have outside their own borders on humanity and the planet. So unlike all of these other country rankings, it completely ignores what they do domestically. Not because that's unimportant, obviously, what countries do domestically is very important, but it's measured in 1,000 other places, and there's no point in me repeating all of that good work. What hadn't been measured was, should I feel glad that this country exists if I'm not one of its citizens, basically? So that's what the Good Country Index tries to measure.
And one of the places that we should be less happy about, apparently, when I was looking at the list, was Britain. Britain used to be number 8 in 2016, and then something happened and we slipped down, I think, to 15, if memory serves correctly. So why did we become that much worse within one, or am I wrong? Have we become less have we have less of a positive impact on the world?
Well, if it's true that Britain has slipped down that far, that number doesn't seem quite right to me. In my recollection, the UK has not ever slipped outside the top 10, but I could well be wrong. I can actually check while we're talking about this, because I think it's important that we're sure
Either
about.
way, it's very important. Yes, I mean, fact checking is and live fact checking, ladies and gentlemen, for what this is exceedingly important. We have examples. Sorry, I'm talking directly to camera here in a Joe Biden sort of way. We need to make sure that we are talking about facts here, and it is possible. We are talking about this live here that Britain is doing well. It's also possible that we're doing badly. Simon, over to you.
Thank you, Matt. No, my apologies for doubting you. The UK is indeed currently at 15th position in the currently published index. What I wanted to say is that because this is an index that includes 160 different countries, seldom fewer than 150, the precise ranking isn't so important as the cluster in which you find yourself. So basically, if you're anywhere in the top 25% of countries, which the UK always has been, then broadly speaking, your contribution to the world outside your borders is a positive one. In other words, you're probably doing a reasonable job of harmonizing your domestic and your international responsibilities, which is what I describe as being the gold standard of good governance in the age in which we're living. So I don't think there's an awful lot of point in poring over the tiny changes in ranking. If we're number 6 or number 10 or number 15, that's only a worry if there's a trajectory. And the UK doesn't appear to be pursuing an obvious trajectory downwards. It's just a little vacillation from year to year, which is normal.
Yes, because it's if we could just sort of quickly or dwell on that particular point. George Orwell in The Lion and the Unicorn talks about two types of people in Britain. The sort of the aristocracy and tends to be conservative, and everything is absolutely perfect. It's sort of Panglossian world, the blessed plot and all of that stuff. And then there are people who tend to be more liberal or Labour-like, and then they have everything is wrong with him. Anything that can ever be positive is terrible in Britain. And he said that's sort of like a national disease that we have. So you would say, and perhaps presumably not coming from the perspective of the aristocracy, that Britain actually, for all its tiny little, for all its flaws, is actually making a positive contribution to the world.
Well, more than most, although, as I've often said about the Good Country Index, coming at the top of the index doesn't mean that a country is contributing massively to the world outside its own borders. The reality is that none really do. And if the Good Country Index really reflected the contributions that countries made, the top 40 spaces should probably be blank. And where are we? Finland, number 1 of the current edition, should be 41. Because not even Finland or the Netherlands or Sweden or Ireland, the countries that regularly come very high up in the index, they're not doing anything nearly like enough if we're to stave off the grand challenges. And that's what this is really all about. The reason why humanity is facing all of these existential challenges at the moment is not because we don't know the solutions to them. We do know the solutions. The reason that we're not implementing those solutions is because the international community is so divided, because the basic culture of governance is still fundamentally competitive, and it needs to become fundamentally collaborative. And sure, countries like Britain and Finland are a little more enthusiastic about international collaboration than, for example, some of the desperately poor countries at the bottom of the index. That's for sure. And certainly more so than Trump's America. But still, I can't think of a single country that really achieves what I call that good standard, where they successfully harmonize their domestic and their international responsibilities. They've managed to do the right thing for their own people and their own slice of territory, and do no harm or potentially even do good for people in other countries and the rest of the planet. And my argument in the book, The Good Country Equation, is basically an equation that explains how it's not only possible to harmonize your domestic and international responsibilities, but it actually produces better results, both domestically and internationally, if you do it.
Just so I want to come back to the equation in a second, but just because you mentioned a number of countries that are doing exceedingly well on your index, and some of those are Netherlands, you've got Sweden, you've got Finland. And what I find becomes slightly sort of puzzling about those countries is that those are all countries that have extremely successful, very far right parties. I was just checking the opinion polls. In Finland, a third of the voters would vote for the True Finns at the moment. The Netherlands, 25% would vote for Geert Wilders' PVV, I think they're called, or Freedom Party, which is a very far right, xenophobic, anti-Islamist party. And if you go to Sweden, 20% would vote for the Swedish Democrats. So those places that seem to be doing rather well overseas are also places where we've got people who are well to the right of the likes of Nigel Farage and possibly even the British Defence League. Is that puzzling?
No, not really, because they're all minority parties, and they don't have a huge impact on those countries' foreign policies, despite them having, of course, nationalistic tendencies. They haven't yet succeeded in significantly diminishing the amount of good that those countries do overseas. And when I talk about doing good, I'm not just talking about the obvious things like donating money for poverty reduction. Because that's an easy thing for rich countries to do. I'm talking about a whole wide range of different ways of engaging. It's not about how much money rich countries spend on poor countries. That's a very narrow way of looking at the issue. Yeah. And also, perhaps you could argue that it's a sign of a healthy democracy if there are contrarian voices. Perhaps it's a sign that there's something wrong if they have to be so extreme to get the point across. But either way, I wouldn't expect it to affect their ranking in the Good Country Index, because that doesn't relate to domestic circumstances very directly.
So in a way, it's sort of like the safety valve of democracy, that when things go a little bit too far, you need to be able to articulate that. And in some ways, perhaps in Britain, where we don't have proportional representation, we don't allow that view to be aired and therefore also to be debated, and legitimate concerns might not be voiced here, whereas they are in Finland, the Netherlands, etc.
Yes, although the metaphor of the safety valve suggests that all of that extremist feeling is just steam, in other words, a nuisance that needs to be got rid of. And I think that might be a dangerous way of looking at it. I think it has to be taken much more seriously than that. It is if a lot of people are very unhappy and indeed very angry, then you really do have to ask yourself very carefully, why are they angry, and is there something wrong with the way that the country has been governed up until now? My own view about all of this extreme right and extreme left and globalist versus localist is that these are all very dodgy narratives. They are the result of our tendency to tribalism, and they encourage and stimulate tribalism. And I think that all of us need to work a little bit harder on understanding that neo-fascist or that progressive isn't a member of an enemy tribe. It's just you on a different day. If we try hard enough, we can all understand what it might feel like to feel that way. If our circumstances were a tiny bit different, if our personal experience was a tiny bit different, if we had a slightly different worldview. And the narratives that push these to the extremes make things worse.
But one of the things you say in the book, and I'll try to quote from it, when you're talking about immigration, which is one of the things that we're just talking about here, and you're saying that we're getting, in the developed world, we're getting the equation seriously wrong. We're refusing to undergo even the very mild and temporary discomfort in exchange for the actual survival of many thousand others, which is, amen to that. But it doesn't seem that we are getting that. I mean, with the so-called far right, we seem to be getting the equation even more wrong. We need to be, there might be people here who say, well, we need to help a little bit on that continuum. We seem to be sliding towards the other end of the continuum, where we just basically say, well, it's just not our problem. I think Karen Brady, who's of Conservative member of the House of Lords, also known from The Apprentice, was speaking in the Lords not long ago, where she said we just have to completely cut down and not have any development aid whatsoever. So that's sort of what we're up against.
Yes, development aid and migration, obviously rather different stories. I'm very interested in conversations, proposals for replacing development aid with something more effective, but presumably that's not what she had in mind. In terms of migration, the the point I make in the book, it is a very old-fashioned one, and on this particular point, um, I'm I don't feel inclined to be particularly relativistic about it. I think migration is a very simple equation, really. We have a duty to prevent suffering in all members of the human race, irrespective of what passport they carry. If their own government, for whatever reason, is incapable of ensuring their safety, then others have to step in. That seems to me to be very straightforward. That's a moral duty, to use an old-fashioned term. And if that sounds very conservative or very liberal, I have no idea which one that is, but it's just what I think is right. And by the same token, if other people in other parts of the world are suffering very seriously, and we can alleviate that suffering by undergoing some very mild discomfort ourselves, then very clearly we have to make that choice. And as I say, the part that you were just quoting is what comes after that and says, in many, many cases, we're not just refusing to undergo mild discomfort for slightly more comfort on the part of the migrants, we're actually prepared to risk their safety, their lives, in return for a sort of imaginary possible future cultural discomfort. I'm not sure that I'll recognize my high street any longer. I'm sorry, that's just wrong. It's just wrong.
So I'll just go back a little bit further. So I sort of slightly, I know you like the book to be, and the book is a crescendo of an argument, which, and maybe just go back to the beginning of the book where you said, to put it into context for, I don't know if you have a copy of the book here, because I was just going to quote the subtitle of it, which is to repair the world in one generation, it says. Underneath, and I, of course, earlier you said that you wouldn't really take Mr. Biden's call if he asked for rebranding. Now, if he then tries pleadingly to try again, in one generation seems quite impressive to be able to do that. I mean, he's got 4 years. What would you say? What's the impact of it? Well, I'll come back to some of the things you. But in your word, how do you do that? I mean, people don't seem to be getting the point about the migration, moral or not. So isn't there a danger that you're just sort of saying, well, this would be a nice idea, but it ends up just being a nice idea?
Oh, well, there's always that risk. I hope that if people take the trouble to read the book, they'll see that it isn't just a nice idea. It's actually got some quite concrete plans in it. The reason why I pick that phrase "one generation" is not simply to sound provocative. It's because one generation is a very, very significant space of time in human history, because that's the time it takes to renew humanity. And basically, in a sense, this is an acknowledgement that all of the grand challenges that humanity is facing today, from climate change and pandemics right the way down to small arms proliferation and landmines, all of those challenges have one thing in common, and that is that they're all caused by the behavior of human beings. They're all our fault. And if you want to change the world, you have to change humanity. And if you want to change humanity, it does take a generation, because it requires a different kind of education. It's really as simple as that. So what the book says is that there are two things wrong with the world. There aren't 50 things wrong with it. There are two things. One of them is the way that countries behave. And we talked about this a little bit earlier, the fact that the fundamental culture of governance is one of competition or conflict rather than cooperation or collaboration. And the book is full of discussion about how we could gradually change that culture of the international community. The other reason is the way that people behave. And the reason why people behave the way they behave is because of the way they've grown up, the way they've been brought up, the way they've been educated. And as we know, whatever the big question is, the answer is always education. So what I'm arguing is that it's time for a new global compact on the fundamental educational values or virtues or skill sets or whatever they might end up being, that we all of us around the world agree we want to be instilled in the next generation, so that they run towards the grand challenges instead of running away from them, as our generation has done. A world of Greta Thunberg, if you like. Greta Thunberg is a perfect example of how you repair the world in one generation. Because in Swedish schools, they teach a lot about climate change, and they do it very well. Here's a young woman who, as soon as she left school, indeed before she left school, felt a very, very strong compulsion to run towards the problem of climate change rather than running away from it. Now that's
apparently, fact check, she's just apparently back to school during the lockdown now. She's opted for that, but be that as it may. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. But the point is that we know that works. Of course we do. And there are 10,000 to 100,000 projects around the planet at the moment, from Sweden to Kenya and top to bottom, teaching children about the necessary skills to live in a highly globalized world. Citizenship, tolerance, sustainable behavior, and all the rest of it. But my argument is that the situation is now too urgent for us to be able to be satisfied with this very fragmented, very piecemeal approach. The time has come for us to have a global agreement, and say, let's implement this globally. Because if we wait for the Swedish initiative and the Kenyan initiative and the Irish initiative, we're still going to be waiting in 3 generations, and we don't have 3 generations. So to make it happen in 1 generation, we need a compact now. So I'm arguing, let's have, and this is a project called the Good Generation, which I'm running at the moment. We get a global agreement, a big crowdsourced online conversation, including people from every country on earth, saying, what are those fundamental values that we all agree with, irrespective of our race, creed, religion, background, culture, and all the rest of it? And then let's just put those in a global compact, get every education minister in the world to sign it, and move forward from that point onwards. And a lot of people do say to me, well, yeah, but how realistic is that, considering what a sensitive topic, quite rightly, the education of children is, and all those cultural and religious differences? How can you possibly get past those? And my only argument at the moment is, it's a little soon to say specifically, but my strongest argument is we've done it before. If you take a look at the last period in history when arguably humanity was undergoing as much threat and stress as it is today, after the Second World War, we managed to achieve the International Agreement on Human Rights. We managed to achieve the UN Charter. And these are fantastic documents that demonstrate so beautifully how humanity really can agree on very sensitive topics when it really understands the need to do so. And I'm arguing that now is one of those times and we should get on and do it.
But if I'm not completely mistaken, in 1948, we also had the Soviet Union who eagerly signed up to all of that because they had free elections that just happened to be won by the Communist Party, and we had China and we had Pol Pot. So it's relatively easy to write things, but it's quite difficult to implement them, isn't it?
Yes, but it's even more difficult to implement them if you haven't written them first. So I'm doing this one step at a time.
Fair enough. That's a reasonable point. You've also, I suppose you're not just talking, you're also acting. And in the book, you have a wonderful description of your trip to Afghanistan, flying in helicopter, sitting behind the guy with the gun. And there's sort of a certain, this is just for the audience here, there's a certain James Bond feel to this sort of.
Oh, thank you. That wasn't intentional.
No, that was, well, I mean, I don't know if that's not supposed to be, but it reads quite nicely. And I had in my sort of my, you know, I was feeling that I was sort of out there in the front line. I could feel the dust coming up in my nostrils as I was reading it. And then, of course, as you land, in metaphorically as well as for real, you start thinking about what can be done about it. You have in your mind eruditely Voltaire's, and I will just look after my garden. And then quite practically, you come up with 3 things where you say you need to satisfy, as it were, 3 appetites. And you talk about the cultural appetite, the intellectual appetite, the spiritual appetite, and the animal appetite, which is, I think, it's a sort of a Maslowian kind of appetite. But I think the cultural one, especially given that Coventry is the capital of culture next year, I'd just be interested in that particular aspect, because most of these books, and there are very few books like yours, but most of the books that are on making the world a better place deal with economics and if you like, the animal appetite, just basic needs. And there'll be a little bit about the intellectual appetites, but very little about the cultural one. And I wonder if you could just sort of spell out a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, the point about the cultural appetite and the very human need for it to be satisfied and kept satisfied in order for a society to be a healthy society is a theme that runs in and out of the whole book. And the reason for that is very simple. It's because the only way that nations, the people of countries, can ever feel a strong bond with people in other countries, which is a necessary condition for us to move forward and survive, is through cultural exchange. For me, that's what culture is all about. It's the way that nations make friends with each other. And people in the old days, when I used to work a lot on this question of the images of countries, people would often say to me, okay, you say that nation branding doesn't work. Well, what does work? And I would always say the only thing that I've ever seen working in terms of improving the standing of a country is cultural relations. It takes a long time. It requires huge patience. It's not very expensive. You need a very large number of very dedicated people. But in time, what cultural relations between countries does is it creates an almost unbreakable bond between the populations of those countries. And what happens as a result of effective cultural relations sustained over many, many decades is that almost whatever you do to the people in a country with whom you've had those relations, they can't hate you. They can hate what you do, but they can't hate you. And there was some apocryphal study that was done in Iraq after the second time that America and its allies invaded. And somebody interviewed a lot of young men in Basra and asked them what they felt about the American soldiers and the British soldiers being on the street corners in their own city. And basically they responded as you would expect them to, which is to say, I want them to go home, slightly more vigorously than that. But then when the investigator probed a bit, they said, yeah, actually, I don't mind the British soldiers being here, as long as they behave themselves, but I want the Americans to go home. And then it turned out, according to this story, that a great many of the young men who they'd interviewed had been using the British Council library in Basra. Now, I've been searching for years to try and find the source of this story. I'm sure it didn't arise from nowhere, but there's something quite plausible about it because I've seen similar effects over and over and over again. Once you've done cultural relations, and by cultural relations, I don't mean cultural promotion. I don't mean spending a whole bunch of taxpayers' money just trying to force people to admire your glorious past. I mean the mutuality of which the British Council so regularly speaks, where you engage in culture with people from other countries. You share your cultural experiences. You look at their culture as much as show them yours. And over time, doing that, it means that you have an insight into the soul of the other country. And once you've done that, hate is so much harder. So I think it's uniquely important as a tool of peace building. Uniquely, there's nothing else that does it.
And I suppose this sort of rather segues into, I think we're all very concerned about rising. It's almost like an underlying theme that we have, which is the question, what gives you hope? And I was wondering, sort of almost in conclusion, if you can talk about what gives you hope, because actually this is a very hopeful book. I'm a cynic, I'm a political scientist, I'm always skeptical. And actually, a number of things you've said are actually rather positive. So I was wondering if you could just, well, say what gives you hope on the basis of this.
Well, very unfashionably, a whole bunch of stuff. I'm super optimistic at the moment, partly because things are so very, very bad. And experience suggests that the greatest enemy to progress is complacency. And when things are not bad, we're overwhelmed by complacency. A lot of the arguments in my book, I just couldn't get through to left or to right, to localists or to globalists 10 years ago, because everybody thought that it was all a bit kind of theoretical. Today, suddenly it looks real. And nobody's feeling very complacent at the moment. Everybody's feeling, whichever side of whichever divide you fancy you're on, everybody's thinking at the moment, this is a time of extreme risk and extreme danger. And that's the best possible time to be suggesting new approaches to things and new diagnoses. The thing that makes me most hopeful is my kids' generation, Generation Z or Z.
Yeah.
I think they're the best generation we've ever had. And they have taken on their shoulders, as far as I can tell, a great many of them around the world, the burden of these challenges that we and our parents and grandparents have caused, and are absolutely committed to fixing them. And at the same time, they don't suffer from these irritating diseases like racism and intolerance because they were brought up in an international world. So a lot of this stuff is just fixing itself naturally. I'm super optimistic.
That's wonderful, Simon. So thank you very much for taking part of this conversation. We end on a positive note, and I think we can all appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks, man.